So, good morning, afternoon, possibly evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today to learn about stepping outside your tech stack. As was mentioned, please forgive me. It is 4 a.m. for me, and I am avoiding caffeine at the moment. So, if I fall asleep mid-sentence, someone be prepared to unmute and have a horn at the ready for me. Um, again, my name is Stephanie Reis, and my background is in all sorts of data wizardry, engineering, development, administration, but all of this began about 12 years ago when I started teaching myself SQL. I was a data analyst at the time and was tired of waiting for other people to provide me data sets. Since then, I have been finding new tools and new skills to learn, places to poke my nose that it may or may not have belonged. And I'm a huge believer in the benefits of learning, although it can be challenging at times. It's something I hope to encourage more people to do. The idea for this presentation actually started about 8 months ago, back when I was job hunting. As I scrolled through listings, I started noticing something weird. The same job title, data engineer, could mean wildly different things depending on who was hiring. Some roles wanted something like an infrastructure architect, some wanted something more like a BI developer, and then some just wanted a miracle. So while putting this presentation together, I went to LinkedIn and pulled the first 10 job postings I found for data engineer. Unsurprisingly, there were a few common threads, but they were often super vague. Now, sometimes these tools are interchangeable, especially if you can pitch your experience well in an interview. So if you've worked with managed instances in AWS, for example, you can probably figure out how to do it in Azure without too much pain. But some tools or skills were unique to just one or two listings, like oddly specific skills or tools. And at the time, this gave me a lot of anxiety that I wasn't prepared or I was sort of behind in some way. So I coped the only way I knew how, which was diving right into the deep end. So I had started hearing a lot about the free year of Microsoft services you can do, and I knew I wanted to learn more about CI/CD. And the combination of those two ideas kind of got away from me. In hindsight, I probably should have picked one new tool to focus on, but c'est la vie. So my plan was to build a process in Python to extract my Spotify listening data and load it into an Azure managed Postgres database. I'd run the whole thing serverlessly with Azure functions and then orchestrate it using GitHub Actions. Sounds simple, right? Before this project, I had used Python for several years, but mostly in smaller implementations like writing integrations. And I had made one prior attempt at a serverless Lambda function in AWS, but that was the extent of my background with any of this. So today we're going to walk through some of the things I learned over the course of this project and life in general, what I'd recommend for getting started with a new tool, some of the common pitfalls you might run into along the way. We'll also talk about how to recognize when you're stuck and what you can do to get unstuck. And then we'll aim to wrap up at around the 40 or 45-minute mark for questions and feedback. But before we jump into all that, let's see how I did. So I'm going to hand things off to someone I trust deeply, past Stephanie. She's already been through it. She's well prepared and she doesn't have stage fright. So take it away, past Stephanie. Thanks, present Stephanie. Past Stephanie here, recording from my natural habitat, a dark corner of the house, and overly optimistic about how smoothly this demo is going to go. To get us started, let's take a look in my Azure function. As you can see here, this is the init file. I'll do a quick refresh just so you can see this is the current state. I'm going to walk you through how the GitHub action will process my changes to the files so you can see them come through and update here. And then we'll get into the Postgres database and the actual function performance. So we can see this is the present state of the init file. So now if I switch over to VS Code, I'm just going to add a comment here so we have something to commit. And if we take a look, we can see the additional changes that I've just added. Just add a quick note that this is for the demo. Yes, I'm going to commit. And yes, I want to sync. And then This is going up to GitHub, and then once it sees that there is a commit that comes through, we can go over into GitHub, do a refresh. This is the repository, and we've got this pending icon here indicating we've got an action flowing through. So if we go to the action tab, we can see that it is processing this workflow, and you can go through and look at all the prior workflows. You can also come into this and get a status check for sort of where things are in the process and what part it's working on. So we can see the build portion just finished, and it's working on the deploy at the moment. While this is working, because it does take a couple of minutes, I'll go ahead and show you the Postgres database. So this is the managed instance running off of Azure. I've got a couple of different databases, but for today we'll look at my staging table that has all of my listening history that was recently played. And here I'm just collecting a couple of pieces from the API, and then I added an ID and a timestamp, but we're getting things like the track ID, track name, the duration, the artist name, when it was played, and sort of where I played it from and what the source of that is. The idea is that all of these IDs I can come back to later when I want to do more analysis on it, and I can more easily get the information from the API using these IDs rather than having to collect it all initially through the listening information. So if we go back to the GitHub action, we can take a look in the deploy section and see sort of where it is, and it actually just finished, so that has completed. Now if we go back into my Azure Function app and can look at the file, if I refresh this, we can now see that the comment has been added, so this has flowed all the way through to the Function app. I will say at this point, just a status update for where this project stands. This process flows through. I can get the files into the function. I unfortunately have not made the actual function appear in Azure, and that's because I still need to work through the environment variables and how to store the cache token that I need to log in, and I'll get into that more once we get into the presentation. But for now, I can run the function directly from my computer, so we will take a look at what that looks like. Before we get into that, I will just show you, this is the most recent information that we are looking at. So I'll go ahead and start the actual function so we can start collecting more data. But actually, now that I mentioned that, we need some additional data to add in here. Thankfully, I have some very excellent tunes all lined up and ready to go for just such a situation. So let's give a quick listen to everyone's favorite song. I know everyone's dancing at home to this. Unfortunately, we won't have time to listen to this whole thing today. Thankfully, though, we can fast forward because the Spotify API does require you to actually finish listening to the song before it will put that information into your recently played so that we can then collect it. So I will fast forward through the end. I know everyone is so sad, crying big tears right now, but we can have a listen once the presentation is over. So now that that has completed, if we go back in here, we can see the function is still getting started, and this is set to run every minute. So the next time it runs to pick up, which it just did, we can see I've got some logging information that's starting the pipeline, inserting the records into recently played, pipeline completed successfully, and this will essentially run in another minute, but we might have gotten lucky. And we caught it just in time to get that information in there. So we can see it's flowing through, and as I listen to additional music, those will flow right into here. So that was just a quick demo of where the project is to date. The function app does run on my local computer. I can collect additional information, and the GitHub actions are flowing into Azure from VS Code after I do a commit. So we just need really the final leg to be completed to get it all the way up into the cloud and automated. So with that, I will send it back to you, present day Stephanie. Hope you all enjoy the rest of the presentation, saying goodbye from the past. Thank you, past Stephanie. Now let's jump into how to go about picking your own project. So last year at the Past Summit, I picked up a sticker that said, be brave enough to suck at something new. And that really stuck with me. It's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking you need to get everything right on the first try, or that you should instantly understand something just because you're smart or experienced. But that that almost never happens. And honestly, it shouldn't. That messy learning process, it's a feature, not a bug. That's why it's so important to celebrate every win along the way, whether that's finally getting two things to connect or figuring out how to use a cool new function. It all counts. Those small victories help build momentum and boost your confidence. And it gives you the foundation for whatever you want to take on next. Towards the end of last year, I decided to try woodworking by building a dresser from scratch. And it was one of the first projects I approached without any pressure for it to be perfect. I think the combination of it going in my bedroom and it's for me to use and no one else would ever see it really took the pressure off. And aside from it taking way longer than I expected, it was one of the smoothest and least stressful projects I've ever worked on. I messed up a bunch along the way, but by the time it was done, I had a better sense of how all the pieces fit together and which steps really matter for later stages. So when I made a matching bookcase afterwards, I could actually apply what I'd learned and plan my approach differently. And that's the kind of growth you want, not instant perfection, but progress you can carry forward. And of course, have to have the finished project tax of what that ended up looking like. For technology specific project, you'll probably start with an idea of a tool or skill you'll want to learn. Maybe it's something your current job is trying to implement, or maybe you know you'll need this for a role you want to move into. The key here is to tie that learning to something you already care about. Whatever you're passionate about, could be sports, video games, movies, music. And that's really going to keep you anchored when things start to get tough, because they absolutely will get tough. And the interest is going to help push you through that. For me, the anchor was music, which is why I chose my Spotify listening data to play with. I love listening to it, organizing it, analyzing it. I currently have about 65 playlists, and that's really kind of low for what I'd like to have. Last summer, I spent weeks organizing everything into genre-based playlists and sort of vibe-based playlists. So it's a pretty major obsession for me, but that connection is what kept me coming back to the project. So now I know what you're thinking. Where to find the time, which is arguably the single most important consideration. So here are some ways we can find time to sort of work it in. So first things first, if you can use professional development time at work. Sorry? Okay. So if you can use professional development time at work, absolutely do that. Especially if your project ties into something work related, that's even better. If there's someone at your job who already uses the tool, and you can get their help, absolutely go shadow them. And if you can connect the project to data or skills or people that you're already working with, take advantage of that, because the alternative is going to be doing it on your own time. So if professional development isn't an option, though, you'll need to be a bit more intentional. Set aside time that works for you. Even if it doesn't even need to be like a huge chunk of time, you could start with 30 or 60 minutes, whatever you can squeeze in. The goal is to find a rhythm rather than waiting around for an entire free day to magically appear. And remember, everyone's different. So for me, 30-minute chunks don't cut it. I need a solid 3 hours to get focused and make real progress. It is definitely not the most convenient setup, but I know that about myself, so I have to make time for it when I can. Another trick is to use your downtime. Now, I'm absolutely not saying to give up social media or your time to relax, but if your project is tied to something you're already really into, you might find yourself thinking about it during those in-between moments when you're waiting in line, waiting for coffee, waiting for Netflix to stop buffering. Those are all great times to Google an error you've been stuck on or to read a bit of documentation. It will all add up. And finally, it's okay to pause. If life gets in the way, if you need to take a break, if it's just not your top priority right now, that's all fine. Step away, take care of what you need to. The project will still be there when you're ready to come back to it. And if you've tied it to something you're genuinely interested in, chances are it'll pull you back in naturally. And that's what happened for me. I had to step away from this project more than once, but my interest in collecting my Spotify data never went away. And that's what kept me coming back to it and continues to bring me back to it to finish it. So next up are the problems you're likely to come across. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the big F, failure. I want to take a moment to talk about the weight the word failure can carry. For a lot of people, it's a loaded term. If we look at the literal definitions, though, failure means 1, a lack of success, 2, the omission of expected or required action, or 3, something not functioning the way it should. Nowhere in there does it say that failure equals being less valuable or less competent. It's not, it's an evaluation of a specific action or outcome, not a reflection of who you are. And it's really easy to internalize failure as a personal flaw, but really our growth comes from persistence, not perfection. And failure is a natural part of the learning journey, learning something new. But if that word still feels really heavy for you, then you can absolutely call it something else. Call it trial and error. Call it finding ways that didn't work, as Thomas Edison did. What matters is that you make peace with the fact that not everything is going to work right the first time, and that's okay. That's how you learn. One of the common ways this can show up is with documentation. We've all been there. Learning a new skill or not, documentation issues will happen. It's basically a rite of passage. Starting with inconsistent documentation, at some point, you're almost guaranteed to find your question answered in 2 completely different ways. For me, the standout moment was with my YAML configuration file for GitHub Actions. When I first created the Azure function and linked it to my GitHub repo, it auto-generated the file for me, which was great. But then things started to not work. So I went and found an official Azure doc with an example file, and it looked nothing like mine. One had separate steps for build and deploy, and the other combined them into a single step. So then came the classic time sink of trying to figure out which one was right for my situation. Another fun flavor of this is missing software dependencies or missing critical steps. When I was working on this project, it's on my personal laptop, which at the time didn't have much in the way of development tools installed. So I'd try to run something, hit an error, look it up, and find out I was missing yet another piece of software. It was like a scavenger hunt, but every clue just told me to install something else. And finally, there's the issue of assumed knowledge, whether it's in a repo's README file or buried deep in the library's documentation. Some steps are just kind of skipped. And if you're someone like me who needs to understand the basics to see how everything fits together, that missing context can really slow you down. It's hard to build a second floor if you don't know you need the foundation first. Another challenge could be with error messages. Oh, yay. This one's a classic challenge, though. You get something like expected value to be neither null nor undefined. It's like, cool, but which value, though? Who can say? Or the infamous punctuation mishap, where you've accidentally used a period instead of a comma, but the error message gives you nothing, just a vague suggestion that somewhere, somehow, you've committed a tiny invisible crime. And then there's a silent fail, where everything looks fine, green check marks across the board, and yet the thing that was supposed to happen didn't at all. This was hands down the most frustrating part of my projects. At one point, I had my Python code working locally. Everything was going smooth. I pushed the changes. GitHub Actions would kick in, build and deploy the code to Azure. Everything looked successful. No errors, no warnings, green lights all the way. But when I checked, no function. And it turns out this wasn't just one silent fail. This was layers of silent failure. The first one was the Python files didn't even make it into Azure. As you saw earlier, I did overcome that one. So the files are now in there, but still no function, even though everything looks happy, but under the hood, it must be total chaos. These kind of errors are so much harder to debug because there's no obvious trail to follow. And I think to some extent, these things are just part of working in tech. They're annoyances we all deal with. But when you're learning something new, they carry a little more weight. It's not just a missing file, it's a confidence hit, and it makes it feel a lot heavier. So now that we've covered some of the common roadblocks, let's talk about the signs you might be stuck, because recognizing it early can save you a whole lot of time, frustration, and Googling the same error for the 17th time. The first sign is if you are running the same thing over and over, but expecting different results. Even if you're making minor changes, at that point, you're just guessing and hoping you find what the issue really is. You're not being intentional about identifying the actual problem and correcting appropriately. Earlier this year, I got one of those daily desk calendars, the kind with a different New York Times crossword puzzle every day. And I thought, hey, this will be a fun little brain boost to start my day. Turns out it was a very great way to humble myself repeatedly. But I fall into this trap pretty often where I'll see a clue and my brain immediately locks onto one meaning. Like the clue will just say the word advance. And my brain thinks, oh, that means to move forward. Got it. So I'll start rattling off words like progress, push, go. But none of them fit. And then the answer ends up being just the word loan. And I sit there thinking, oh, okay, you mean that meaning for advance. And I realized I should have questioned the first assumption and thought more broadly about the word's different meanings. Another clue you're stuck is if you stop actually reading, like you've seen the error before, so your brain goes, oh yeah, this again, I know what this is, and you skip ahead. But you might have missed something new. Or if there's a warning and you think, oh, that's probably unrelated, and just move on. Or you're just skimming documentation, hoping the right answer kind of jumps out at you. Basically, you've switched from problem-solving mode to guess and hope. And that's when it's time to slow down and actually pay better attention to what you're doing. Okay, so let's talk about the emotional signs. Frustration, irritation, losing your temper. Those are all easier to recognize, but sometimes it can show up differently. It might look like sadness, anxiety, or a sense of defeat. You might feel yourself losing interest in the project altogether. And sometimes you don't even realize you're having an emotional response. You just start avoiding the work. You don't want to think about it. You don't want to talk about it. And maybe people close to you have even pointed that out. These are all signs that something needs to shift and it's time to take a different approach. So there's a lot of messaging out there today that promotes pushing through adversity, never giving up, the idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But that's not the whole story. Not all adversity leads to growth. In fact, severe stress and unrelenting pressure can cause lasting negative effects. It can lead to burnout, emotional exhaustion, and real long-term harm. That's why rest and recovery aren't just nice to have, they're absolutely essential. When you push too hard for too long, it doesn't build resilience, it drains it. Mental fatigue sits in, motivation drops, performance suffers. Taking breaks is what allows us to move forward sustainably. Early on in this project, I thought I was really close to being done. My Python code was working and I thought I had my YAML file set up correctly, but I couldn't get it to build and deploy successfully through GitHub Actions. And over one weekend, I spent nearly 20 hours trying to figure it out. And I still didn't solve it at the end of the weekend. After that, I didn't touch the project for about 2 months. Looking back, I should have stepped away a lot sooner. Pushing through for that long without progress made me avoid the project entirely. I didn't want to think about it, look at it, talk about it. And that delay really set me back much more than if I had just taken a break and come back to it maybe the following weekend. It's also totally okay to pivot. That might be necessary. That's something I didn't realize soon enough in my project. Trying to automate user collection data as my first Azure function project probably wasn't the right scope. Beyond the basic setup, it required figuring out how to store and retrieve cache tokens. The library I'm using only needs a one-time login, via a web page, and then after that, it manages the user token and cache. But that meant I had to determine what kind of object in Azure could store that information and then how to access it during runtime. Once I realized how complex that part of the process was, I should have switched to a different tool until I was more familiar with Azure, or picked a simpler implementation to get the Azure experience at a lower level. It's important to come back to your original goal at times like this. What were you originally trying to learn? What were you hoping to accomplish? If the path you're on doesn't make sense right now, there's no harm in adjusting course. And there's almost always another way to reach the same goal. This also reminds me of a time I tried to mountain bike. It seemed like a great idea. Get outside, get fresh air, a little adventure. The next thing I know, I'm at the top of a mountain, looking around, like, cool, where are all the beginner trails? And there was not one, just a series of steep, terrifying expert level runs. So I did what any logical person would do. I just walked the bike all the way down. It was definitely less mountain biking and more mountain hiking with a very expensive prop. But in this case, pivoting was a smart move. It was required for safety and just basic bodily integrity. So if you're starting to notice some of these signs, whether they're emotional, mental, or just a sense of being stuck, what can you do about it? First, start by stepping back, taking a break, giving yourself space to reset. Maybe it's time to pivot your approach or revisit your original goal. But don't forget, you can also reach out for help. That's not a weakness. It's a normal, healthy part of the learning process. Feeling stuck doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It just means it's time for support and a new perspective. So now let's talk through some of the resources that can really make a difference when you're starting to feel overwhelmed and you're not sure what to try next. Well, if you're anything like me, your first instinct is to avoid asking other humans for help at all costs. So let's start with the LLMs. They've basically become unavoidable in tech. People use them for everything these days. And honestly, they're super helpful in a lot of areas. There are a lot of pros and cons, and we could spend hours debating those. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus on what I actually used and what was helpful for me. So ChatGPT was my go-to for getting started. It was great for clarifying syntax, learning best practices, and getting advice on how to structure my code. Basically, it helped me get a sense for what I was trying to do. But ChatGPT isn't just for work, right? I have friends who co-write stories with it, others who get daily memes from it. My personal favorite is to get it to rewrite boring emails in sea shanty lingo, which is just peak productivity, especially on a Friday. And then there's Microsoft Copilot. I leaned on this once I started setting up the actual Azure components, the resource groups, managed instances, key vaults, storage accounts, all the tiny moving parts you need to stand up like one instance of the function. Copilot was super useful for where do I click kinds of questions. ChatGPT didn't always know where a certain setting lived in the Azure portal, but Copilot was great at pointing me to the right spot once I already knew what I was trying to do. And then GitHub Copilot, though, that one really came through in terms of error handling and troubleshooting. If there was a bug in a specific file, it could highlight it. If I knew which chunk of code had an issue, it often suggested cleaner or more functional alternatives. It was almost like having a coding buddy who didn't judge you for Googling how to format a date time for the umpteenth time. And another option you've got, of course, is professional help. Now, this one may or may not come with a price tag, so that's something to keep in mind. Personally, I had mixed experiences with these. When I first signed up with a free Microsoft trial, I ended up having to submit a billing support ticket, which turned out to be super helpful because I got to talk to an actual human. The issue was account related. When I linked my GitHub, it somehow pulled the email I originally used to create it, which was back in college, and it decided that should be my domain name. So I was trying to move the free subscription to a different account, which I could not, but at least I got to talk to someone and confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. There are also support subscriptions available. Be sure to read the fine print on these, though. I thought I was signing up for the ability to submit development support tickets. What I actually got was access to post questions in the community forum where eventually someone will reply. So if you go this route, just make sure you know exactly what you're getting. Now, training classes, I'm a big fan of these, especially if you can find them for free. There are some great sites and YouTube channels that walk you through specific tools and skills step by step. Even if you're stuck, sometimes watching someone go through it is enough to get you motivated again, which is actually what happened to me as well. I ended up taking a couple of Microsoft training courses, one through work and one my mentor recommended. One of them included a section on setting up Azure functions, and that part was exactly what I needed. It helped me see how to fix an issue I was having, and more importantly, it gave me a push to get back into the project. If professional help isn't in the cards, another great option is joining a network. And the good news is these come in all sorts of flavors. Chances are there are people in your community who are learning the exact same thing as you or have spent years mastering it. So why not take advantage of that brain power? The SQL community in particular is awesome about this. Between local user groups and events like SQL Saturday, there are tons of opportunities to learn and connect. These sites here are a good place to start if you want to find events near you. I've done both of them and I always come away learning something new. Another option is meetup.com. It covers way more than just tech stuff. If you're into it, there is probably a group for it. Hiking, reading, deep conversations. There's actually a group near me that meets up monthly to go eat Swedish pancakes and then go kayaking. So there's definitely something for everyone. I ended up joining a Python specific group while I was working on this project and went to one of their meetups. Just being in a room with people working on the same tool helped. Even though we weren't working on the same project, and even if I didn't ask anyone questions, being in the shared space kept me focused, and it carved out this dedicated block of time that was like, okay, we're all focused on doing Python right now. And since you're here today at this presentation, you already get the power of community and the value of showing up to conferences such as this. So conferences are a great way to learn, get inspired, and meet new people. And as always, if you can find them for free, take advantage. I actually just stumbled upon one last night. I didn't have time to put it in here, but apparently there's Microsoft Build is going on next week. If you go in person, there is a cost. It's based in Seattle, actually, but you can sign up for free to partake in it next week. If in-person events aren't really your thing, no worries. There are a ton of online communities you can tap into, and they can be incredibly helpful. I use them all the time when researching problems. You get the benefits of a whole lot of smart people all working through the same kinds of issues. That being said, I'll be honest, I personally struggle with imposter syndrome, so actually posting questions in these forums is super tough for me. I worry that the answer is already out there, or I just haven't found it yet, or that the question is too basic. So I get it, it can be uncomfortable. But if you're comfortable asking, I'd really encourage you to go for it, because chances are someone else is going to have the exact same problem later, and your question might be the one that helps them out. So it's not just about getting your question answered, it's about contributing to the collective "we've all been there" archive. So Reddit is made up of subreddits, if you're unfamiliar, basically little communities that are focused on a specific topic, item, idea, person, pretty much anything. These are just a few of the tech-focused ones I've browsed or chimed in on from time to time. The Microsoft community also has several spaces to explore. While I was working on this presentation, I stumbled across something called the Learning Rooms, which I haven't tried them yet, but they actually look super promising, and I'm definitely planning on checking those out soon. And of course, there's Stack Overflow, the legendary resource and home to both brilliant answers and the occasional very humbling experience. But beyond the standard Q&A, they actually have a few other spaces that are worth exploring too. Slack communities can be a great resource, but you kind of have to know where to look for these. They're often shared by word of mouth or mentioned in other forums. The SQL community Slack, for example, I heard about at Past Summit last year, or actually 2 years ago, and it's huge. It's got over 21,000 members. Discord works in a similar way. You need to find the right link invite. This one actually, the Azure Discord I found because it was linked right at the top of the Azure subreddit. So that was very convenient. So to recap, we started this whole section by acknowledging that sometimes you just don't want to deal with people. And then I proceeded to throw a bunch of people at you. But whether you're lurking quietly or asking a question or just want to feel less alone in the struggle, these communities can make a real difference. But I appreciate the desire to perhaps only interact with a single person. So can we just phone a friend? And I'm happy to say the answer is yes. You can always reach out to someone you're comfortable with. In fact, they don't even need to be technical to be helpful. Talking to someone one-on-one can be incredibly helpful regardless of their technical background. Even if the only person available is a friend or family member in a totally different field, ask if you can explain what you're trying to do and what it is you're working on. The act of explaining forces you to slow down and break things down at a much more basic level, which often reveals knowledge gaps you didn't realize you had. And because they're not in the weeds with you, they'll probably ask questions that seem obvious, but those questions can spark new ideas that help you spot something that you completely overlooked. For me, a big part of this project ended up being this presentation itself. And like every other part of this project, I got stuck here too. My partner is a teacher, so I asked them to listen to what the project was about and what I was planning to present. And their feedback was really helpful in rethinking how I was organizing everything. They really brought a totally different perspective to how to deliver the information that I never would have thought of. If you have access to someone who's technical, even if they're not familiar with the specific thing you're working on, even better, you still have to slow down and explain what you're doing, but they can also offer suggestions or point you to resources you might not have considered. At one point during my project, I asked my friend if I could talk him through what I was trying to do. He's a BI architect, but didn't have much background in Azure Functions or GitHub Actions. And honestly, that conversation was probably one of the most helpful things I did the entire project. Just the act of walking through everything out loud helped me catch something I had been completely misreading. And on top of that, he made the super simple suggestion of trying GitHub Copilot, which I hadn't realized was something I could easily add onto Visual Studio. So that one conversation unlocked a huge part of my process. And finally, if you have access to an expert, absolutely use them. Experts didn't become experts overnight, and they've likely been exactly where you are. And there's a good chance they've seen the issue you're dealing with or something very close to it. Even if they can't pinpoint the problem right away, they can usually point you in the right direction. And that alone can save you hours of trial and error. Beyond that, they might inspire you to approach the problem differently or think about your questions in a new way. A few weeks ago, I started taking swing dancing classes. The instructors actually learned how to do the Lindy Hop from some of the original creators of the dance. And I can't even describe how much easier it is to learn from someone who's not only been doing it for years, but has been teaching it for years. There's no question they don't understand. They've seen every sort of beginner misstep and they know exactly how to break things down. And they just make the whole experience really fun. So learning from someone with that level of experience doesn't just make things easier, it makes them enjoyable. So regardless of what you're learning, if you have access to someone with that depth of knowledge, absolutely take advantage of it. It can make all the difference. Which brings us to a quick recap of everything we've covered today. So if there's something you want or need to learn, try tying it to something you already love and are genuinely curious about. It'll help you get excited about the project and stay motivated when you hit those inevitable roadblocks. You know your schedule, your priorities, how your brain works better than anyone else, so lean into that. Finding the timing and structure that actually works best for you is so important, and you're going to get stuck. It's part of the process. But if you can recognize the signs early, you can pause, reset, and figure out what you need, whether that's rest, a new approach, or just someone to talk it through with. And don't forget to use all the tools in your toolkit. There's so many ways to get help: online communities, meetups, mentors, friends, even non-experts can offer insights just by listening. And sometimes your plans will need to change, and that's okay. Pivoting doesn't mean you're off track. You're still learning, and that's progress. Because progress isn't linear and toughing it out isn't always the answer. Real growth will come from rest, reflection, and reaching out when you need to. So I want to thank everyone so much today for coming to my session. And with that, does anyone have any questions?